See, this is like the only state you would see my wallpaper, and you can probably figure out who it is. They got some road named after them up here, last I saw. Oh, I'm giving away the jokes. Well, hello. Thanks for having me here. Let me start my timer so that I'll end like 10 minutes over. As said, yeah, I go by my last name because my name is, as many of you out there, I'm sure, my name is Michael, which was established in my first job where there were 5 other Michaels, is not a very useful name. And then I worked at Dell, where it was even more useless. So I go by my last name. So this talk I'm going to give is, it's a combination of a talk of, as I like to colloquially say, like sucking less at doing software, and also looking at how DevOps and other things are used to help out with that. And it starts off with kind of a contextualization of why we're here and some industry analyst nonsense. And then it gets into some stuff that makes me pretend like I know what I'm talking about technically, but sort of aimed more at large organizations than small ones. Although, you know, maybe small ones need help too, but usually they're pretty well off. So before I get into that, we have a podcast recording later on today at 3. So if you're not into what other kind of like crazy open sessions are going on, I think there's Arrested Development and the Food Fight Show and the one that I do, Software Defined Talk. Obviously, you know which one's the best out of those 3. So feel free to come check that out and be in the audience and heckle us. And if by that point you still don't know what DevOps is, to report back to your boss or your personal captain's log, maybe you can come and have us like comment on it. So that's me up there. Just to say who I am, I work at Pivotal at the moment, if you remember my excellent, very pro pitch from yesterday. We have a table out over there. We've given away all our books, but there's PDFs and we have stickers. They're pretty nice, I think. So I work in marketing, basically. We don't call it evangelist, but I work on the evangelism team where we go out and try to explain what Pivotal is and make people think in a way that's favorable towards giving us money for the offerings that we have, which is pretty much what an evangelist does. Last I looked, I mean, I'm no Guy Kawasaki, but I think that fits in well. For several times in my career, I was an industry analyst, last at 451 Research, heading up the team that focuses on infrastructure software. I'll move on. I'm sure that made people fall asleep. And then I worked at a little firm called Red Monk for about 6 years, where we focused on open source and development and all this stuff. So I know what I'm talking about. And in between that, I worked at Dell in corporate strategy and M&A for software and cloud. I live in Austin, so you're supposed to like work there for 2 years, you check that off, and then they let you keep living there. And now I work at Dell again, if you follow the news, which is great. I think there's a handful of us in Austin. We have the most square footage of office space of any Pivotal employee in our town. So I'm looking forward to getting badge access to that. And if you like my prattling and nonsense, you can go to my blog, and I mentioned the podcast. I also write a monthly column at the Register, ostensibly about DevOps, but as any monthly column actually is, it's about whatever I can figure out to write 5 days after the deadline. So you can check that out, and you know, if you really want to like stick on your rubber hazmat suit, you can go into the columns and see like some nonsense in there. That's some craziness. So let's start off. This is sort of like you guys, judging from the lack of extensive button shirts and dry cleaning, you probably don't care about the pitch that's about making money. So I'll get to this one, more personal motivation. And you know, I go out in my my work as an analyst and as whatever it is else I do nowadays as an evangelist, and I encounter a lot of these Eeyore people, right, in IT. I get a lot of, and it happens a lot up, as we say, in North Texas as well. A lot of people who are like, yeah, that all sounds great, but I live in a house made out of sticks that was always knocked over, and I'm a donkey. Like, we suck. So thanks for visiting, and I really appreciate these sandwiches from Jason's. I'll pass those out to the rest of the office. So I think what you want to think about is like, you know, it's fine to be a donkey. It's kind of an adorable creature, but you should try to be happier, right? Like, you want to figure out how to use stuff like DevOps days. I mean, you're certainly not coming here for the coffee. So you want to come here for like the knowledge and like to figure out like how to improve things and do better at work. Because I find that if you're happy at your work, if you take a certain amount of pride in your craftsmanship, whether or not you're living in a stick house or like one of these boring one-story office parks, but if you're doing your work really well, you're generally much more happier. And you know, you can still be attached to a bad tail, but maybe you'll actually enjoy it. So let's figure out, like, before we get into kind of moving from the Eeyore world, like how did we get in the situation where we have DevOps days and we're worried about, you know, using computers in a new way, and you know, there's all sorts of, I think that someone made a dandy phrase out of when you pull together like Facebook and Google and all that. I think it was, I don't know, Glam or some weird thing like that. But like, I'm sure a lot of why you're here is someone was like, why can't we be more like Facebook? Or like, we don't want Uber to take over our industry, right? And so because I always talk like that. And you know, how did we get in this situation? And this is the businessy part. So if you want to go get refilled on whatever that brown fluid is back there, if you run out of it, this is a good time if you don't like business stuff. But the reason that, I don't mean to be insulting people for the coffee, it's lovely. It's right in front of me. This is like, I really like this quote because it kind of sums up very briefly a lot of what we see going on in the business world with respect to IT. There's a lot of other stuff going on in the business world, but when it comes to what us nerds can help out with, it's kind of summed up here. Now that's, if you're not up on your Fortune 500 mugshots up there, that's Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JPMC, who's still there. Extremely well respected in the role he's on. You know, I don't think he shows up in a bad way in front of Congress too much. But this is from his shareholder letter of 2015. They're also a lovely customer of Pivotal's. They're great people. This, if you go read the shareholder letter, as I guess I did, you find this part. And I've abridged it a little bit, but it has a lot of great stuff going on in this sentiment, in this idea of what companies are looking for. One, there's this recognition that the nerds are coming, or you know, Silicon Valley, which is more just saying that small teams of people doing software are going to come erode our centuries-old lock on this market by just using computers. Oh my God, what's happening? I can't even print, right? And so it's great to have this acknowledgement that this is occurring so that people don't have their head in the sand. It turns out ostriches don't actually do that, right? You wouldn't think ostriches like would have lived so long if whenever danger presented itself, they immediately stopped and stuck their head in the sand. So you can kind of work that one out on your own. But you know, the next part of this is like, and he says it very politely because it's in a fancy PDF that some New York design firm like probably spent some good money on. And he's like, we're going to kick their ass. Right? Like if you read this other part, he's like, we have all sorts of assets and things like that. We know they're coming and we're not going to let them take our lunch, right? Because we like our lunches. We don't order from no Jasons. Like we get good lunch. And so like this is awesome, especially if you're like Pivotal and you're selling into this market. It is really a pull to do something more with computers. So you got all these fancy people like who have their nice lunches and they really are looking towards IT to help out and be competitive and stay alive. So the next question you should be asking is like, so how are we going to do with that, my Eeyore friends? And indeed, you can't really read this, so I'll read it for you. But if you look at surveys, this one's from the Cote Consortium, and there's all sorts of problems with it, but it's representative of stuff, and it also fits into my story. If you look at this question, which is, what's your IT organization's role in business innovation? And we go down to, there's several interesting ones, and this is a great survey because it has 3 years of data, which means it's super maybe legit. What you see is the answer to the question you can't see is it says, key enabler for business innovation, right? So we've got this situation where businesses want to use IT to come up with new things and innovate and really use it. And then if you read back in 2015, only about 30% of IT was useful for that. Now, I don't know what the rest of IT is doing, like maybe installing new versions of Windows and figuring out what to do about iOS 10 or something like that. But like, really, this is a depressing stat, and it's kind of why we have a lot of Eeyores, right? Like, if you think about it, I'm sure everyone in this room, you're on the right side of that 30%, but when you get together with your friends and they're really upset and you're having a beer, maybe you can empathize with them. Key part of DevOps, empathizing over beer, is that in aggregate, most of IT is not really useful for business. So, like, what are we going to do about this? Because definitely we don't want to end up in this situation, right? Like, this is from one of my favorite clip art makers. You can look him up in Pixabay. But, you know, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but this is not a cool situation, right? Like, very bad. For one thing, there's an escalator, right? Which, that's never really good. You might get your flip-flop stuck in that. And it's just like, this is kind of like the apocalypse that a lot of IT has in front of them if they don't really fix their stuff, as it were. And so to sum that up, you know, when you're an analyst, you always try to come up with like theories and names for stuff. So, you know, here I am doing that. I can never get rid of my my analyst blood. It's a pretty good life if you want to get into it. Just ask me afterwards. But this is kind of like the theory that I try to put together that comes up with a reason for IT to improve. Now, there's a little footnote down here. I won't go into this too much because my time's a little limited, but you know, if find one of your MBA friends, I mean, I assume you have at least one, and ask them about like competitive advantage and Michael Porter and how that establishes a way that companies can reap profits and stay alive. Well, there's this great theory from Professor Rita McGrath down there. You can get an HBR article. The book's actually pretty good. And the idea there is that competitive advantage is very short-lived. It doesn't last long. Companies have to continually innovate and come up with new things for a variety of reasons. And as you can imagine, if you're a Java programmer, you might be happy that someone uses the transient keyword. It's transient advantage that's going on here. So companies have to innovate a lot more. They don't innovate so much, right? What can we in the IT department do? Well, we could make better software, right? Because I'm pretty sure like upgrading to the most recent version of your firewall firmware or whatever and getting your desktops upgraded, not really going to be helpful for the business, right? That's like, it's good to have AC, but it's really not going to help you differentiate from your competitors. So essentially, you want to figure out what we can do to help out. And I think doing better custom software is really what we need to do. But as we saw with the escalator, not a cool scene, right? So we need to improve how we do that. And that's really what I think a lot of, to me, what DevOps is all about and what DevOps days are about is how can we improve the craft of what we're doing by learning from people, you know, you would assume who are successful. It's good to, like, I guess, negatively learn or learn the negatives from people who aren't successful. But when we look at people who are doing things well, what can we pull from them so that we can improve the way that we're doing IT? Like, whether we're doing online banking or selling cardboard boxes, whatever it is. Like, I've always thought maybe in mining, you don't really need a lot of custom-written software. But you probably could use some somewhere. I bet there's a complicated supply chain of stuff where there's a lot of weird, as we used to say, B2B software that needs improvement. So this is the overall mindset. And I used to be a developer back when I did real work, so I always approach things from a developer standpoint. And the overall mindset that I think you start taking on when you want to improve how you're doing software is this idea of what I like to call small batch thinking. And there's a lot of names that this goes by. Like, what's that old book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces or whatever? So this idea of doing small batches has lots of stuff. And I just, you know, like to rename things in kind of like Microsoft style to my own phrasing for it. And this is the one that I choose, right? And the point of a small batch approach, right? Like, if you look up at, like, it's really hard to see. This is a great image up here. This guy has awesome hair. And if you're my age, he's sort of like, you know, was your enemy for much of your life before you, like, relaxed and got a job and got out of high school. Anyways, he's got a nice hairstyle. I suppose he oddly might resemble some people who are hosting this event, if you look at it too closely. But very, very unintentional there. Sharp dresser over there. Obviously not me. I actually forgot to wear bring my shirt, so that's why I'm wearing a t-shirt. I apologize. You have this mentality from business, and, you know, you might call this waterfall or whatever, but it's this notion that we know exactly what it is we need to do with the computers, right? If those damn nerds would just write the software that allows someone to go to the site and buy the thing, I don't know why that's so hard, right? Like, they need to do it, right? And this is even an attitude that I think in IT we've internalized a little bit ourselves, right? Like, for some reason, you know, decades after realizing it was not a good idea, we still make big MRDs and huge documents and all this upfront planning, right? We have this assumption we know what's going on. Whereas when I look at people who are, to steal a word from the DevOps report, high performers, I guess that's a phrase, but maybe there's a hyphen, the people who more like, they perfect themselves, they perfect a process of what they're doing. They always admit that they have no idea what's going on, like this dog down here. But they do know how to put a process in place, a culture, if you want to use a DevOps days word, for improving it and figuring out what to do. And so that, when I think about what a small batch process is, when applied to software, that's the mentality that you have. And all of this, you know, is sort of familiar, like most things I talk about, but it's the arrangement of it and the fun clip art that I make that really differentiates it. Anyways, if you look at a small batch approach, you can think of it as like OODA or whichever one if you want to be all cool and fighter jetty, or you can think about PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act from Lean, or you can think about, I don't know, continuous delivery from like software stuff, or if you're like really old school, the scientific method from Sir Francis Bacon. You know, get him together with Lord Sandwich and you'd have a delicious combo there. But essentially, it's this idea that, you know, what you should do is, if you're faced with a problem, you should come up with the theory of how to fix it. Now, what's good and bad about a theory? What's good about a theory is that you can test it to see if it's true. What's bad is it's just a theory, right? And that people who don't believe in the earth getting hotter are like, it's only a theory, so it's not true. But anyways, when you have a theory, you can test it. So what you do is you think about, how would I solve this problem? And how can I validate it? Well, in the software world, the way you validate it is you write some code and you get it in front of users and you see what happens. And then if it works out and not assumes, but it proves your theory, then you've got something good and you keep doing more of that. And if it says your theory is wrong, you don't do that and you try something new. And you have to do this on the small part is like if you do this on, let's say, a weekly basis or a month if you're like relaxing. If you do it on a weekly basis, think about how many experiments you can do a year. I mean, you got to have some vacations, and there's like Thanksgiving and other stuff, so it's not 52, but you definitely get a huge amount of velocity that you achieve trying to figure out how to improve the software that you have. And I'll go over a lot of how we end up implementing this is with our friend, the continuous delivery pipeline. And I'll go over a case here in a little bit. But, the important part and why I like to show this is like, the little green boxes there. Like, that's pretty obvious what's in a delivery pipeline. I mean, hopefully it's obvious. If you don't, then you should read up on that. But what I think you really need to start thinking about when you have this pipeline in place is that feedback loop, right? So if you're delivering code every week into production or every day, you can start observing how users are using it and make it better and increase the productivity of it. And this is very important for that nightmare escalator scene, right? Because you need to figure out how to do software better to help run your business better. And if you're delivering every 6, 12 months, you're just going to be caught flat-footed and not really be able to improve at a rate that you need to. So what do you do with that power, right? We're back to our dog friend here. What you end up doing with this tool of small batch thinking is having a more user-centric design for your software. And if you're an ops person and you're like, yeah, F those users, well, good for you. But, think about how you fit into this sort of way of providing that service and how you can help the developers who really have no idea about how ops works. As a former developer, I'll assure you of that. We don't, man pages really just put our hair in a bad state. But you can really, all of us need to get involved in IT and figuring out how to solve the user's problem, whether that's an internal user or a customer or whatever. And historically, we're really poor at it. If you've seen this is a great little image. It's a second generation of it, right? But the joke is, for those who haven't seen it, right? Like the user asked for this swing over here, and what they really wanted was a tire swing. Like the user didn't really even know what they wanted, and all these various roles they come up with many, many different other things. My favorite one there, if I remember, is that how the customer was billed. Like you see that big roller coaster. All they wanted was a tire swing, and instead they helped Oracle not meet their quarterly expectations. See that's the vendor in me popping out. Very rude, very rude. Anyways. So a good case of that. So this is a project that some of the people at Pivotal did with the IRS, and you can go look up the video of it. The video is great. It has an IRS person and a Pivotal person going over it. And this is a very simple example, which hopefully in this part of the country in Texas is going to be careful about encouraging people about the IRS or not. But it's a good example that's simple about taking this user-centric design and small batch thinking. So. Sometimes people forget to pay forget to pay their taxes, and then they're what you call delinquent. And it turns out, if you don't pay your taxes, every day you owe more taxes, because, it's the government. Like, what, are you not going to choose them? So you should really know how much money you owe, and so you would think people would be interested in looking that up because they would stop to have that daily interest being applied to it. So the IRS, being the collector of money, we of course want them to have as little money as possible, a little self-interest there. And so they've been using call centers to do this, like you have to call them up and figure out like how much money you owe, and it's always shifting around, and it's kind of annoying, and I don't know if you ever called a call center. It's an escalator situation there. So they thought, hey, computers, they can do this. So their idea was, what we should do is have a web application where people log in, and it tells them like what they owe the IRS. And being highly technical people, accountants, I'm sure a developer would think this way. They're like, we got the complete history of all the information, maximal data. Let's put all that data up there, right? So they put your complete financial history with the IRS up there. And sure enough, they test this out with users, and the users are confused. They're like, I still don't understand how much money I owe. So they had a failed experiment. Their theory was we put all the information, it'll solve the problem. And so it turns out, and it sounds ridiculous when you say it, or ridiculous, that if someone wants to know how much money they owe the IRS, they really only want to know how much money you owe the IRS. So they changed the UI around to just show that, and boom, everything worked out fine, right? Now again, that sounds really obvious, stupidly obvious. But the point is, we all make assumptions like this when we design our software, and then 12 months later we can fix our bad assumptions, or 6 months later, right? Whereas if you take more of a smaller batch approach, and you're very cognizant of being that dog instead of that finely haired person, right? And you take this more humble approach, you can discover these things and improve your user's experience, and make sure we get money to build all those highways named after old presidents. So that's sort of like the mindset, kind of like the project manager mindset that you have. And if you think a lot about the tools and everything that DevOps is helping you do, right? It's all driving towards that end, in my opinion, right? It's setting yourself up so you can take a small batch approach to improve the software that you're delivering. And if it's not doing that, then maybe it's not worth the hassle of doing DevOps, because it seems like what else are you going to get than making your software better? I guess it could be fun, like skateboarding alone, but really that's I don't know, you should do that on your own time. Anyhow, so as we kind of delve into it, let's look at the sort of practices underneath that, the way that developers and operators change the way they operate, to use a lot of weird words, to get to that point. Now, first of all, I think what's good for the developers, there's a lot we could say about developers, and I took about all the nonsense about microservices and cloud platforms and 12-factor stuff and all that. That's a whole other situation we could discuss. But the first thing that you should do is, if you're a developer and you're like, oh, we do Agile. Like, we've been doing Agile since the days of COBOL and assembly. I get a lot of comments like that on my register columns, which is just fantastic. Those guys are, they don't really know how to spell words. They're always putting Z's and U's and stuff anyways. So, if you look at this survey from Gartner, to kind of the way you read this is, these are a bunch of Agile practices that you have down the side. So the first thing you want to do is benchmark yourself, like, do I know what those are? And do we do them? And then what you want to do is look at the blue and the green column, and you can't really read it here, but when you look through that, it turns out that most people in aggregate aren't really doing Agile, right? They're not doing all the practices of Agile. They just cherry pick and do the easy thing, but it's kind of shocking that something that's proven out as Agile is not really done more widely, right? Like, much more less than half of the market, as we would say, are not doing a full-on Agile practices, which is crazy, right? That's like, it's almost 20 years later, and there's people who might complain that Agile is like, boring and tedious, but like, it works. And why wouldn't you be doing something that works instead of other things? I mean, this is where you get back to living in a stick house. So what you want to do in the development side of the house is really take an assessment and see if you're actually doing Agile software development, right? Don't ever assume that you're doing it. Like, there's the old saying journalists have, right? Like, if your mom tells you she loves you, check it out, right? Like, you need to verify that this stuff is actually happening. So then, on the operator side of things, when we look at DevOps, right, and I think at this point, we don't really need to make this point, but when you look at surveys of adoption and people's plans for doing adoption, it's actually gone over the hump of, like crazy people who like dancing bears over stuff that actually works, right? So it's climbing up the diffusion of innovation curve. It's becoming normal and mainstream. And there are still many fewer people who are not doing DevOps than doing it, but it is something, as it seems like some of the people here, it's being foisted on them, and it's something that's going to happen, right? So it becomes something that you actually want to do, and it is, when you see people doing it, it actually does work very well for them, as we'll get into. So I was told this morning over the eggs and delicious sausage that there's a lot of questions about what exactly DevOps is. Now, I'm not really going to answer that question for you, but I'm going to demonstrate why that question is asked so many times. So, my own rendition of how DevOps came about, and there's a good summary of it there, right? Like, it's just an explanation of the word. It's one of the more self-descriptive titles for things. It's sometime in the mid-2000s, you had all these, as we used to call them, .com companies. And they had to differentiate by putting new features out as much as possible, right? Like, I'm sure there was some pitched battling between Friendster, MySpace, and Facebook at some point. And they had to out-feature each other. Now, that means they have to deliver features all the time. And if you're one of those ops people, you're like, yes, delivering features all the time. That means nothing will ever work. Congratulations. So that was the other challenge that they had, is the stuff had to actually work, right? So they needed to really get, I don't know what the name of this paradox is, but for a long time in IT, we've had this notion that the best way to keep something up and running is to never change it, right? Which I think was considered a fact for quite some time. So DevOps is really a way to get through that fact. That's sort of like one of the main things it's trying to get over, is like, we need maximum uptime, and they're very clever. They change it to resilience instead of uptime. It's always good when you're measured on something to blow up the measurements so you can come up with a new one to measure yourself by. But the goal is we want to be able to release software as frequently as possible and also have it work and have maximum uptime. And, it'd be nice if we had people who, like, didn't hate each other and they were happy and they had work-life balance and all those other, like, as we saw earlier today, great myths that never really pan out too well. But, if we have less stressful work, maybe, and we're more successful, maybe we'll also be happier and we'll be less Eeyore. So that to me is like the way that DevOps came about. And if you think about how it came about, that explains a lot of what it is and what it's become. Now, as has been discussed many times, right? Like I've followed DevOps a long time, since when it was called Agile Infrastructure and things like that. We always like to define DevOps by technology, and we do that over and over again, and it never really pans out well. Now, you can't see that whiteboard over there, but it's a good one to look up. You should get the footnotes, and you'll have a good chuckle from one of our chef friends over there who did that one. But it's not something you define by the technology that's used necessarily. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. And as I'm doing here, we've been really bad, if you will, shitty, at defining what DevOps is, until very recently in the DevOps report. And I'm not going to go over these. I would point you to it. But this year and last year's DevOps report actually takes, I think, the best sort of swag at defining what the practices of DevOps are. And then, you got to be careful. It doesn't cause anything. It just sort of happens to be that if you do these things, they're strongly correlated, or some kind of science mumbo-jumbo, to like good benefits and outcomes that you have. But you can look up the reports here, and you can't really read them. But there's practices in here that you hear people going over with DevOps, right? Like limiting the amount of work in progress that you have, which is another way of thinking about doing small batch things. Checking everything into version control. All these very specific practices. And it explains how each of those things contribute to characteristics that higher performing organizations have. So if you're left still wondering what DevOps is, just go read the last 2 years of the DevOps report. One, there's some awesome pictures of like people living up in the Pacific Northwest and the fine life that they have. There might even be people writing on glass, which is always nice to see. But two, it'll actually give you a pretty strong handhold on what it is you would be doing if you're doing DevOps. So like I said, I'm not really going to tell you, but I'll give you some links. So next, I want to go over what I encounter most often as the real problems for doing something like DevOps, right? People can understand what DevOps is. They can get behind this idea of like, I don't want to be Eeyore, and what we want to, sure, that all sounds great, but like I work at a company and they suck, right? So like, how do I change that? Right? Like that's really a lot of where the problems go. And like as I'm fond of joking, I guess I'm fond of it, like, it's not a software problem, it's not a hardware problem, it's a meatware problem. Like it's a person problem that you have. So how do we get over that stuff, right? That's really what you need to start focusing on. It's a lot like this, I'm sure you've seen Dune, right? Like some weird bald old person shows up and tells you to do some weird thing, and it's going to suddenly transform you, and you're like, well, what's going on? I just want the leftover sandwiches from that weird meeting earlier today. So I think in particular, large organizations need to pay attention to this, because if you go back to the DevOps report, there was some questions around it, not like criticisms, but just some genuine like, hey, let's look at that data more from people in the community. And it turns out if you take some cuts at the data, it's large organizations with 10,000 or more people who have the most difficulty being successful at DevOps and changing, which I guess isn't intuitively surprising, but it's good to double underline that if you're in a large organization, you particularly have these problems. So let me close out. I'll probably go about 5 minutes over, if that's all right. Let me close out with some tips, particularly for large organizations, but really for organizations that are resistant to changing. So the first one that I see is, you could call it the DevOps theater anti-pattern. And this kind of sets the stage for like, it's kind of like the Agile survey, right? Like you may think you're doing Agile, but you're probably not. And similarly, transforming your organization, you've probably had transformation efforts underway for many times at your company, but for the most part, people don't actually do it, right? Like if you remember this scene from Mad Men, right? Like his formerly drunk buddy, he sits down with Don there, and he's like, you know what you need to do, Don? You need to do some fucking work, right? Like, stop traipsing around the office and pretending like you're a big high and mighty guy in your fancy apartment here, and do some work, right? And that's really what transformation is about, is it's hard, it's annoying. There's probably people who will get fired and leave, but like you need to change how you're doing that organization, or it's like escalator time. Like you really got to work on it and fix it around. And I'll skip over this slide because I just made the point. If you look at surveys, people are a problem. So the primary thing you need to think about, and for all of you out there who aren't managers or your individual contributors or whatever fanciful name you choose for a person who lives at the whim of someone else, the thing you need to check on is how committed management is. And if you're a manager, this part's for you. Like in a large organization, and I would argue in any organization beyond a one-team organization, success is going to be started and finished. That is, but management is incredibly important in making transformation happen, right? So management sets up the game and how things are going to operate, and they have to really also take a small batch approach to the organization and come up with new ways to run it and how to change it around. They have to be working on it day in and day out, right? Like, it can't really be what I always think of it as a Christmas tree manager, right? A manager's in a meeting and everything's either like green, yellow, or red. And they figure out, like, when we look at the Christmas tree, what's going on with that status, right? Instead, they need to become change managers and agents of change and really work on that. And these are two books that are really great for that, especially this Leading the Transformation one. And the other one is really a little booklet targeted at managers who want to know how they do metrics and management around this. But the point is that management really needs to be committed to doing this change. So, this is a good way, one, for managers to check it in individuals is if you feel like management is faking it and they're not kind of like down there in the trenches with you. Like if they're still wearing like all their suits and they're not wearing like t-shirts and hoodies, which is a cheesy, weird way of rating it, but it's sort of like they're becoming part of your, as we say around here, culture. Like you're really going to have this other weird management effect who's probably just, more interested in those fancy lunches than your sad sandwiches. And you want to make sure that they're committed and involved. So always be on the lookout for how they're doing it, which again, is another reason for management to really be involved in helping you. On one of my podcasts, I talk with my friend Matt Curry there about just this point. He's got a great talk on how management has to show that they're committed to doing things. So the next thing that older, larger companies always have that becomes an issue for being successful, not only at DevOps, but for improving how software is done, is they're always like, oh, we got a lot of legacy software. What do we do with legacy? And I'll say two things on that. One is, there's no good answers. So congratulations on identifying a hard problem, right? Like if you've gotten to the point where you're held back by your legacy systems, your technical debt, then, that's sort of like a house that you built for yourself, or your predecessors did. But it's sort of, that is a result of not having good portfolio management in place and not having a way of changing things around and letting things rot, right? So as I'm fond of advising, the first thing you should do is see if you have portfolio management in place. And then remember, if your mom tells you you're doing portfolio management, you should check it out, right? Like you should make sure you're actually doing it. And if you don't have a way of managing your portfolio of software in place, I would recommend Jeffrey Moore's Escape Velocity. It's actually written for software vendors, but the approach that he has for making sure that you don't neglect your long-term fortune for short-term goals is pretty good in there. And, it's just the usual, stick a bunch of BCG stuff in a blender and see what smoothie comes out the other end. But that's a bunch of MBA talk. You can use that with your friends. But it's a good way of thinking about how you avoid having legacy problems. And there are actually some good software workarounds like stranglers and all that nonsense that you can use to cope with legacy. So next, there's always a lot of, the next complaint that you get, especially, there's usually some DevOps talks about this, is auditors and compliance. And like it's just a series of Dr. No's all the way down, right, who are telling you can't do things. Now, with auditors, they essentially, my understanding of an auditor is they just want to make sure you're not being dumb, right? Like here's something that we need to follow. Do you have these practices in place? How can you ensure that you're actually doing them, right? I need documentation and proof that you're not doing dumb stuff, all right? Which if you think about it, the way that we do software is actually kind of hard to prove, right? It's kind of like if you turn in your math homework and there's just an answer there. Like, you got to show your work, and that's what auditors are often after. Now, the other things that auditors suffer from, and compliance people, is they don't come to these events and they don't keep up to speed on things because that's not their job, right? So what they don't realize, and this is a register column I think I wrote up, if I can read the notes down there, but what you need to do is, this first of all is shocking fact. It always helps to go talk with people who are telling you no. That's a fun thing to do. But once you go talk with them, you can explain to them how taking on this small batch approach, how automating a tremendous amount of what you're doing, right, is generating a huge amount of the things they're looking for. And in fact, A more rigorous, disciplined approach, which is a lot of what DevOps does, will give auditors a lot more of the tools and the things that they want. It'll actually reduce the risks that they have and help you have all sorts of new controls that you wouldn't have with the old way of doing stuff, right? This is another sort of fallacy of thinking when you're doing change management, is you assume that what you're currently doing is working, right? And that you need to do better than it. Whereas in fact, usually when you're changing, you just need to do good because you're doing terrible currently, right? Like you don't need to replace an okay level of things. You're operating from a negative deficiency. So then the next practice that I see people having difficulties with, but that's been proven to be very successful is, you know, there's a joke at our recent conference that apparently all you have to do is like throw 2 pizzas into a room and a DevOps team spontaneously creates itself, which is I wish I'd come up with that. But you know, it is true that we definitely do this at Pivotal, and you see this across the industry, that when you have a small team that has all of the roles needed to do the project, right, from developing to designing to project management, sometimes to security and audits and also operations, and you dedicate to that team, you end up with better results, right? Which again, intuitively, it's like, that sounds great, but we suck, so we can't do it, right? And so getting to that part is really difficult, but you have to figure out how to set up being successful at that and proving that out. Because if you're not doing that, it's going to be much more difficult to improve your situation. And there's all sorts of, I always put lots of references here. I don't know if you saw the URL at the beginning, I'll put it at the end, but there's all sorts of studies and fancy you know, quotes like that to help you persuade other people in Eeyore land to move over to doing what's obviously right if you need to do that. So finally, just wrapping up. So how do you get started, right? So you've gone through all of that. The most critical thing you're going to do for success early on, and you know, the most critical thing is going to be to just keep improving and doing things long term, but you want to pick a series of small pilot applications to learn how to do this thing new, but also bring up internal credibility that this new way is possible and successful, right? So pick some applications, do a quadrant thing on the wall if you're into that, and pick applications that are low risk from the standpoint of if it blows up, not that many bad things will happen, but have some, as we would say, material interest to the business. They're user-facing, they actually touch the business. It's not like a science project, like, look at this new way we can schedule meeting rooms. Like, that wouldn't be a very good project to work on. Something that's real. And find, let's say, 3 to 4 of those projects, and go through the motions of doing that, and think about how you're going to internally market that after you're successful with it. And the reason you pick 3 to 4 is you'll probably screw up one of those and just pretend like that never happened, right? Just like sweep that under the rug. Because I don't know about you, but I've worked at many large companies, and the best way to kill anything good is to fail at it, right? And then immediately there's whisper campaigns, and next thing you know, pneumonia's killing your project, right? You don't want that situation. So be very controlled about that and cognizant of how you use internal marketing to prove out doing these things and when Eeyore is over. So next, the last thing I want to go over, man, hopefully it's the last thing, otherwise I'll be really rude to the next person. The last thing I want to go over is staffing, right? How you think about your people and what you do. So there's 2 things to say here. One is I've been talking with people in large organizations about how they staff these initial projects. And there's this weird line you have to walk of, you want to get those really eager, inventive people, and then it turns out to be just a bunch of like childless, like Halo playing white guys, right? And you're like, this doesn't look good. And so like that selection criteria doesn't intuitively feel good to be your sort of cowboys, if you will, if you look at them over there. And yet you also kind of know that like, well, I do need like adventurous people who, if you don't know that statue down in the Driscoll in Austin, it's called I think the Widowmaker, and it's like, apparently if you get your boot caught in a stirrup there, the best thing to do is to kill the horse before it kills you. And so that's what's happening there. So you need people like that who want to work on projects and they don't mind having a horse shot out from over them, I guess not under them. And that is a particular type of person that you have for the initial projects that you're doing. Now, as you're successful, you'll move over to the other side, and you have people who seemingly, what we might call garbage people, but actually they're incredibly valuable because what they do is they're very stable, they focus on long-term things, and they help society run, right? Like, I've never lived in New York, but I'm pretty sure if they didn't pick up the trash every day, it just wouldn't work, right? Like, it's really important to find these 2 types of people and know when to apply them. And I think if you take more of that kind of mentality of who wants to take risks and who wants a more stable thing, and at different points in your life you want different things, but you want to sort people out in that way and apply their strengths and to some extent their weaknesses that can become strengths, to different phases of a project. And it's easy to think that this is some sort of bimodal IT or something like that. But the point is, it's the mentality of the people, not the process and the tools that they use that's different. It's just their predilections and how they want to operate. So that's my working theory at the moment, is the way you staff out people is based on kind of like what their mentality, where they are in life, and what they want to take on, which I don't think most people really have an HR department that deals with that. So there's another Eeyore problem. But it's something that you want to work on. And then finally, lastly, this is a funny joke, but I find it's quite true, right? A lot of people come to this point in an Eeyore state of mind. They're like, that's great. That's fantastic. Because they also talk like that. But we don't have these vats like they do up in the Pacific Northwest where we can just spontaneously grow these superstars, right? Like that's not really what we do. We're kind of up here in DFW, and we got no vats, right? But in truth, and I actually saw Adrian talk at our event recently, and he confirmed that this did happen. So it's not just verified by Twitter. But when someone confronted Adrian Cote, I guess sort of like Netflix's biggest spokesperson for how awesome they are technically, and also a purveyor of fine information and advice. He really likes cars too. You should ask him about that. He has this funny quip that like, well, we just hired them from you. I don't know what you're complaining about. Like, we hired a lot of these people from you, the people who don't have VATs, and we gave them an environment, a situation, a culture that allowed them to flourish and thrive and seem as if they'd come from a vat of goo. But really, you could do the same thing, right? Now, this isn't universally true, but the point is that more than likely, if you just set up the right kind of culture and the right kind of goals, and you have the right kind of management in place, and clearly you follow all of my advice, then you will be able to have these superstars as well, in addition to hiring other people. But you shouldn't be despondent that you can't find the right people for doing things, because I think all of us, especially the people who take the time to come to this room, you can definitely work on making the software that you work on better, which will help the businesses or the organizations you work on better. And then, that seems like a good goal to have. And you can maybe get some mahogany sticks for your house instead of those weird oak ones that keep rotting. You can improve your situation. So with that, I always like to end with this quote from the Agile Manifesto. I think it's kind of what's driven me, other than my own entertainment over the past 20 or so years when I've done this, is really figuring out how to improve the way software is done and sharing it with other people. And it's what the people on my team do and what Pivotal's really focused on, and hopefully a lot of you in this room will be focused on this as well. And I appreciate the time to go over and everything, and I'll be around later, and remember to come to the podcast. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Cote. Thanks, Cote. So one question before we get to lunch. So if somebody here is new to this and they like what they're hearing, what do you think they should do on Monday when they get back to work?
Sure. I think what I would do on Monday is probably, I haven't read that DevOps handbook yet, but I think the Effective DevOps book is pretty good. And also, like, if you haven't read the 2 DevOps reports, right, those are good. Like, I wouldn't, if you're one of these Monday people, I wouldn't read them for their content. I would, as a liberal arts major, so you learn how to do this kind of thing. Like, I would read them for the words that are in there and be like, this is the language and the frame of mind for this type of thing, right? Like, you got to figure out how people orient and think about this situation. Because if you just sort of like dive into a bunch of DevOps stuff, it sounds like a bunch of like hippie shit, right? Like, it's not very helpful and effective. And so you've got to understand like the framing and where they're coming from. And reading that report will help you out with that. And then I think you can get into the more of effective DevOps stuff, which it's a hard slog to get through the first half of that book if you don't have the frame set of like, oh, we're trying to improve software and therefore improve existence, right? It seems a little too highfalutin, but that'll start giving you a handle on how to do this stuff.
That's awesome. Thank you very much for your talk, and let's give him another hand.